Good morning. Can you hear me?
Morning, Peter.
Good morning, Shannon. Shannon, just before we get started, I just sent you a copy on an email response to Ohio. I don't know what possibilities are for you, but there are meetings this evening, basically this afternoon, I guess your time, to check in on the working groups. And I think one of them is maybe even, gives participants a chance to come in. So if you could just take a look at that and just let us know if it's possible for you to step in there. It just fully conflicts with my defense that I have to be in.
Is that the one that's at 7:45 p.m. on the schedule, the Executive Committee and Working Group Leads meeting?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah, because my defense starts at 7 GMT. And the big challenge that we have, of course, is, written stuff. I'm going to try and get some stuff started in between these sessions, but I have to say I'm going to be running on fumes. With the
What a surprise.
Yeah, getting up at 3:30 in the morning both days and having like 12-hour days. And today will be like a 17-hour day or something. So
yeah,
anyway,
it's 15 to 17. It's a fun day.
yeah.
I decided to skip the panel. I think I'll watch it later.
Yeah, there's just no way I can do all of it. My biggest thing is just it's just scheduling the time, because there's yeah, I'm going to see how this goes if we don't have a lot of discussion here, because we actually covered a lot of these topics yesterday as well, but I'm just going to introduce and see what people think and if we can confirm, but I'm not necessarily expecting this to run the full time.
Okay.
And then we have another one at 10:30. I really don't know what will happen there. That's one for, I'll see if Lil is on this morning, but she was particularly interested in platforms, etc. So at minimum, I'll put together a little deck, and then
Don't worry about putting together any notes for the afternoon, like for the executive meeting though, Peter, because I've been taking notes for this whole thing. I can use my own.
okay, yeah, I'm just maybe we can just do a little bit of a. Are you on the Slack thing?
Sadly, no.
Okay.
That would have been helpful.
Yeah, and
But
I
that's
just
all right.
don't know how to go about doing that. So, um, okay.
I do. If you need me on the Slack, I can
I
ask
I
Bradley.
don't really. I just
Okay.
I'm just making notes as we go on what I think are some of the key things. So maybe we can just touch base somehow between now and the executive meeting, just on what I think the key things at least I'm pulling out, and then you'll have your thoughts and you can just report back. I'm just,
Yeah, if you wanted a summary or something, that would be good.
We do have a session today, like a writing session.
Yeah, I know that one's pretty much right after the. Oh no, it's quite
Yeah. So what I think I'm thinking there is, I'm not sure how many people we'll have on that. It may just be us. It'd probably be a couple of people. When that's fine, I don't want a larger group for a writing session, but I think what I'd like to do is just bullet point and say these are our key messages, key recommendations, etc. I certainly won't be in a wordsmithing space after so much time, and then the defense is actually quite draining. It's 3 hours of defense. So yeah, and had I known, had any of us known, we would not have said it at this time.
We've got the second one that starts tomorrow morning at a much more reasonable hour.
Yeah, it's just they seem to want to. I think you'll see at the executive meeting, but I think they're trying to like put stuff together, for immediately after that. Okay. So that's why it's just tricky, because the timelines are so compressed, and but we'll do what we can do, and I think we have some very good material. We had some really good sessions yesterday, so we'll see what kind of traction we get today. People may have said their piece, and if so, then we could also get started on the writing in the next session.
Okay.
So, okay, I'm going to test my screen share here. Sorry, just kill some of my other applications so I don't.
Hey there, in the meantime.
Ah, good morning.
Good morning. Well, for me, it's almost lunchtime, but
Okay.
yeah, I'm impressed by you getting up in the middle of the night to do this.
Well, it is what it is, yeah. It
I
would have been good if
I got more sleep than yesterday.
a little bit, yeah. Yeah, yesterday we were up an hour earlier, or 2 hours earlier, I think. Yeah. So yeah, so you guys should be able to see.
Yeah, it looks great.
I can.
Okay, and I'm just going to put it into presentation mode and see that it stays. You still see it?
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay.
I was
Yep, and you're
wondering.
moving.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was wondering, do you want me to like have this official start with reading out the script again, or did you have it yesterday?
We did have it yesterday, but I think the idea is that each session could and should be seen as kind of an independent event, because you just don't know who's going to be on that's not been on before and so on. So if you could do that, that would be great. And then also, sure. I think what we did yesterday was we just put the link to the code of conduct into the chat window.
Yeah, I'll do that then. And then I just hand over to you. And yeah, I heard you were talking about maybe having a shorter session.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really do the scheduling as much, so I don't see, I mean, for me, any online session more than 2 hours is a lot. And then yesterday, I would say we did use the time more or less. The last one we didn't. We used sort of 2.5 of 3 hours, but we also had a lot of really good productive discussion. And I don't think we're going to have, an entirely different cast of people today. Yeah. So I think we'll probably just do a summary sort of discussion and then see where people are at. And if people say those are our thoughts, then that'll be that. So.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Good morning, Ruth. Glad you're up so early to join us.
Yes. Ruth gets the award.
I'm pretty sure Ruth's on the same time thing that I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mean as in no particular times?
Yeah.
Naps every so often.
Gotta love Mountain Standard.
Yeah, and then if Matt Jones joins, I mean, he's another hour behind, or 2 actually, if he's home in Alaska. So.
Yep.
Well, thanks for joining, Ruth. I was just saying we may have a smaller group today because I think we got through a lot of really good discussion material yesterday, and I'm not sure who will join, but we'll see. And if we do, we'll just, I think, do a shorter discussion and try and just highlight some of the things that are important about the collaboration and so on.
I've been impressed with the number of people.
Yeah, me too. Sorry, go ahead, Ruth.
I was just saying that you have a little more competition today and that there's several RDA sessions that
okay.
somewhat compete.
Yeah, and that's where I was saying yes, I wish I could clone myself because
Yeah.
I would like to be attending as well. So I will, I'm not going to belabor this to the time unless we need to, like unless we're finding it productive. And I also was really impressed by what we got through yesterday and all the discussion. So,
Well, good.
yeah, I mean, the other thing for us, I sort of highlighted to the AOS organizers is we have had a number of other major meetings. So Helsinki, and then for Shannon and I, we had the Canadian one a few weeks back, and so we don't lack for the discussion. So I think you know, that's a bit different than some of the other groups where this is kind of their primary biannual event. So.
Right. I do have one question, and that is I did finish off the body of the recommendations paper. Um, and I don't know if this is an appropriate venue to try and walk people through those recommendations again as one last check. Because if they're all good, then really, you know, the authors need to take a pass through it. We need to create an abstract and the summary, and it could be submitted.
Yeah, so I would like to do that actually. I'm going to go through probably about a 5 or 7 minute deck just to get some conversation going. We'll see. Said it's getting close to time. We're a small group so far. So, and then we could go through that, and that's something that Shannon, although we'll be submitting that, I think we could just highlight that in our report to the executive later today. As something that we would put in our statement that we're, you know, preparing to submit multiple papers. So great. Well, let's see who comes on, and then we can plan from there.
Sounds good.
Which RDA sessions are today, Ruth, that you're thinking of as well?
You did that just as I switched over
Oh.
to
Sorry.
that's fine. Real world data training for real world impact, progress and use cases from the research metadata schemas working group. It's just, you know, stuff.
Yeah.
Let's see,
No.
it's Wednesday.
We've got all these colliding virtual conferences now.
Right. Sharing reward and credit, brokering framework, progress and confirmation, education and training on handling of research data, and the fair data maturity model. So some of those I might not really be on today because I didn't do any translation of time zones.
Yeah. All right. Well, C2, we had another we had a panel just before this as well. So I'm just going to wait. I'm actually going to give it till 5 past the starting hour before we make any decisions, just because if we do have people who are on that panel or part of that panel attending, they may jump over.
Okay. Yeah, I have to say that I did cut out a few things I was planning on attending just because they were just 24/7 is just not good.
Yeah. Yes.
It looks like we'll be done in time tomorrow that I can do the vocabulary and semantics service, moving towards fair semantics. That would be cool.
Yeah, and yeah, I might try, but I have a feeling I'm going to collapse soon after this. Well, the bigger thing is because of the defense today, if the candidate has any revisions and this and that, she's going to want to deal with them right away. So we'll probably have some back and forth tomorrow after the defense.
Given the, oh, there we go. We got another person. Hooray.
Good morning, all. We're just waiting a few minutes today to get started. There was another panel that was happening just before this. We're also recognizing there is an online RDA meeting going on right now too. So we'll just see in about 3 or 4 minutes where we're at in terms of number of participants, and then we'll decide on how we proceed from there.
Would you like me to start with the script anyways, or
not yet. I just maybe give it a few minutes
okay.
just to see, and then we can start with the script.
Perfect.
Right.
Morning, for those of you just joining, we're just going to give it a few minutes to let people sign on. Good morning. For those of you just joining, we're just going to wait a few minutes before we get started, just to give people a chance to sign on. Shannon, you're good with the notes? Everything's working in terms of the shared document, etc.
Yeah, I'm online now. I've already started writing down participants and everything. It's all good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, we'll give it 1 more minute and then we'll get started. So I'm just going to stop the screen share and I'll start with the agenda. Okay, welcome everybody to Working Group 4 of the 2020 Arctic Observing Summit, and this is session 3. We had a couple of really good sessions yesterday and focused on many different topics. We're planning now to expand on that conversation, and you'll have seen from the agenda that we have an approach where we have particular themes that we would like to discuss in each section, or each session, sorry. And we have the discussion today, discussion of status requirements and developments related to community building, enhancing broad engagement of users, rights holders, stakeholders, and engaging with global level initiatives. But as indicated in the first note, any topic is open for discussion. So if you do have something else that you want to talk about, feel free. Before we get started on our content, we're just going to read through the statement. Lisa's going to bring us through the conference statement, and then we'll go from there.
All right, thank you, Peter, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are, and welcome. also from my side, and I'm just going to read the script to you now. The circumpolar Arctic is the contemporary home to many different indigenous peoples. As researchers and others who are working in or reside in the Arctic, we recognize these lands and waters as the mostly unceded traditional homeland of the indigenous peoples. It is the responsibility of each of us to learn, know, and gain better understanding of the indigenous people and cultures with which we engage. With that in mind, let's engage in open-minded community-building collaboration as described by the AOS2020 Code of Conduct, which I will share in the chat video in a minute. Some logistics before we start the presentation. You joined with your camera off and your audio muted. If you unmute yourself at any time, please remember to re-mute after speaking. How to mute? Press *6 if your phone doesn't have a dedicated mute button. Please keep your phone muted during the presentation and do not put us on hold. Why? We can all hear your typing and conversations when you aren't muted, and the hold button may cause disruption in the presentation. Also avoid the echo. If you have the option, please use headphones or a headset. If you're on the phone, please turn your computer speakers all the way down. We can get an echo when the phone picks up your computer audio. See your controls by hovering your mouse at the bottom of the screen. You can chat and see the other participants via these controls. If you have a question, type your question into the chat window and they will be read out loud. If you need help, message the moderator via the chat tool or the raise hand tool, which is accessed by opening the participant window. Want to join the discussion? Unmute yourself and speak up, or raise your virtual hand and we'll call on you. Or you can send a chat message to the group everyone and the moderator will read the question out loud. For folks without mics, type into the chat monitor will read questions out loud. And this presentation will be recorded. A video file, audio file, slides, and relevant links will all be available on the agenda tab of the AOS website, which I will also pass into the chat window after this. I will now pass it off to the moderator to do introduction and welcome the speakers.
Great, thank you very much. So I've already done a little bit of introduction. We're now going to go into the content of session 3. For those of you interested, we have another session coming up that is 1430 to 1600 GMT. In that session, we're looking to just have some overall discussion about emerging methods and technologies, machine learning, artificial intelligence, e-science, etc. And so I encourage you to come back for that, and we will continue with our last discussion session, and then sessions 5 and 6 that will take place later today, and the other will be tomorrow morning, and those will be focused on working on statement development. So with that, I'll stop this share, and I'm going to start with just a few comments about our current subject, and then we'll just get into open discussion, feedback from community members that are on the call. So for session 3, we're talking about community engagement, community building, how to bring together end users, etc. And I'm just going to go through some slides. I apologize for those of you who were on yesterday. A couple of them are duplicates, but I have some others as well. But first of all, just recognizing that we have a very diverse community that we're working with. There are a number of different organizations, projects, individuals, etc., ranging from very local activities in communities in the Arctic right on through to global initiatives. And everywhere in between. And so one of the things we've been spending a lot of time on over the last decade plus, particularly since International Polar Year, has been bringing these organizations, initiatives together so that we're working as efficiently as possible, so that we're sharing knowledge and information, so that we're sharing the workload, avoiding duplication of effort, and all of that. So what we'd like to do here is just expand on expand on ideas and bring together some ideas that we can put forward in our statement. One of the entities that has been working towards this is the IASK Arctic Data Committee. And so that was formed at the end of 2014. And initially we were working, I think, a little bit more on very specific things like data policy and data statements and so on. In the last couple of years, a lot of the energy has been focused on this community building and bringing people together. The working activities with ADC, but also our sister organizations of the Standing Committee on Antarctic Data Management, or SCADM, as well as the Southern Ocean Observing System, are all very active, and then a number of other partners, as I showed in the first slide, Global Cryosphere Watch, Arctic SDI, and many, many others, is we work in particular groups or working groups. So one called Polder, for example, reports back to the parent committees, and the Polder focuses on federated search. And so we found this to be quite a productive model, in that it really takes a particular objective, a particular theme, and it brings people, interested parties together to focus on that theme, and it's very action oriented. And so, in this case, we've had a number of meetings where we're actually working in hackathons. Ruth Dewar, who is on with us, will likely present on some of the outcomes of that activity too, in the form of a paper that's been developed. We also have the Semantics and Vocabularies Working Group, and this came up a lot yesterday, and is a group that we expect to be working together now with SeonCon and the new initiative that's looking at how to document observing assets, and also the Working Group 1 activities. This group came up yesterday. So again, this is where the parent committee, in the form of ADC, SCADM, and in this case also IARPIC, which is a US interagency group, came together and formed this working group. We've had a number of different meetings. The Polar Data Planning Summit a couple of years ago kicked off a series of meetings that then also followed through later in that year in Geneva with a systems and architecture workshop, where we started digging deeper into some of the technologies. We've had the recent Polar Data Forum that I mentioned a number of times in other sessions. That was held late last year. Again, a combination of working of conference style, as well as working groups and hackathons. So there are, in addition to what's happening at the Arctic level, as well as working with other polar groups, there are many different research data management organizations that are active and that are, I think, important to our work. In fact, as Ruth and I were discussing just before we started off, the Research Data Alliance, or RDA, is holding their virtual conference as we speak. So we have some people, I think, who are probably over there participating in that activity as well. In 2017, we actually co-located the Arctic Data Committee and the SCADM and the SUSE meetings in Montreal with the Research Data Alliance meeting, and we found it quite productive because many of these issues or topics that we're discussing in our community are not specific to the Arctic. When you're thinking about metadata interoperability or even ethical considerations, et cetera, there's a lot happening that are really global issues. And so we want to make sure that we try and intersect with these wherever possible and appropriate. There's also other groups like the World Data System, or WDS, and others, like CODATA, which is related to WDS under the ICSU system. And so they all do, I think, interrelated things, but they have different foci, and there are different groups that we might want to consider working with. We have national initiatives as well. So the keynote speech that that Mark Leggett has provided for this Arctic Observing Summit, it give you a bit of highlight of Research Data Canada, also Research Data Alliance, which is the international component. But we need to think about what's happening in each country as well as what's happening at the international level. Often this is where a lot of the activity is, and particularly the funding. So there's a new entity, for example, in Canada that's being formed, currently called Endrio, which is going to be a major government agency that's focused strictly on research data management. And from my understanding, it's got a very significant budget. It will be at least a 5-year mandate and so on. So for those of us in Canada, this is something that we really need to pay attention to because it's going to be part of everything that we do. The Arctic Data Subteam, I think I already talked about that a little bit through the Vocabularies and Semantics Working Group. This is IARPIC, the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee in the US. I know we have a couple of folks from that group on with us today. And so this has actually been a very active group, and although it is coming out of the US, it's been very global and international in its scope as well. So a lot of activity that reaches beyond the US border. I've talked about the Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability a few times, and we held a Canadian Polar Data Workshop about a month or so ago that Shannon and her team led. And so, you know, again, it was nationally focused, but we often talked about international subjects, issues, etc. And of course, we have the AOS. And so the AOS has become a really important and I think good place to check in every couple of years and to really bring the community together to talk about issues and to think about recommendations, etc. And most importantly, to try and interact closely with others in our community. So going forward, I just wanted to start asking people basically for updates. So current developments in this space, partners, question mark there actually. So who are some of the partners that we may want to engage who are not already engaged? What are some approaches to collaboration, approaches to engaging users, etc. You know, people's vision, capacity is something that we should discuss because I think in years past, particularly maybe pre-IPY and during, one of the challenges has been, you know, how do we get the work done? And I think we're starting to make some good progress there, but we still need to have some discussion. So with that, I'm going to just leave this up on the screen, and I'd like to get an open conversation going with people's thoughts and ideas around those topics. So to start with, Ruth, you had mentioned that you have the paper that potentially you could share with us, the recommendations paper, et cetera, and that might be a good way to get us kicked off in terms of an update.
Okay. Do you want me to share my screen? I actually, believe it or not, have the paper up.
Okay, and I just stopped my screen sharing, so you can do that.
All right, we'll see if I'm actually clever enough to do this at this time of the morning. Here we go. All right, can you see something called Practical Advice to Data Centers to Make Metadata More Fair? Okay, good. All right, so the background of this is that in the series of meetings that Peter was talking about in Geneva and Helsinki and in Boulder before that, a group of us, you can see some of the names here, got together in these forums and started talking about various things. And we did two things. One is we came up with a list of recommendations jointly. And this particular document is a document that kind of talks about each of those recommendations and, oh, and wow, I really am tired. Talks about the recommendations and the reasons why the group thought it was important. And this has been slowly meandering along during the last couple of meetings, but at this point we have a write-up for each of the recommendations. I'm quickly scrolling down to them, and they fall into a couple of categories: technical things, things that people could just do by having managers allocate staff time / funding to doing them. And we can walk through those if we want to do that. And there's technical ones, and then down towards the bottom, there's social and organizational recommendations. And so this is now almost complete. The things that it is missing is one, a double check that we still believe in these recommendations, and two, it needs a abstract and summary, which we said we would do at the very final, you know, after everybody's blessed the interior content, basically. So, Peter, did you want us to actually walk through each of the recommendations?
Why don't we just, if you could select what you think maybe some of the top ones are, or the key recommendations, or things that we may have also been discussing here yesterday, would be great.
Hey Ruth, this is Jonathan. Could you just tell us how did you meet this group of people? How did you decide to start writing this? I may have missed that.
Okay. So this came out of the series of meetings that Peter has been kind of coordinating when he went through his slide deck right at the beginning of this meeting. You know, he talked about a meeting in Boulder, a meeting in Helsinki, a meeting in Geneva, where data people from the Arctic Data Committee and associated related groups all got together in a room and worked on these. And so this is the recommendation side. The other part of that will eventually be another paper that what we started doing was collecting information from all of the data centers we knew about that held Arctic data about, you know, are they harvesting metadata from somebody else? Are they making their data available for harvesting? And what technologies and that sort of thing were they using? And so that's the content of the other paper. But in the meantime, there were a large number of actual recommendations that came out from the various meetings, and each meeting we sort of reviewed them to see if we still agreed with them. And we've finally gotten to the point now where each recommendation has the body of the recommendation itself, and then, you know, a one to many paragraphs about why that particular recommendation is important. Did that help?
Yeah, so it's okay.
So just
the usual suspects for that interact in these various meetings.
Yes, that's exactly right. And a small subset of us, which is, I guess, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, well, about a dozen of us agreed to actually help write this. So technically speaking, each section had a primary, or each recommendation had a primary author responsible for drafting the recommendation and most importantly, the justifying text up. So it's been a group thing. We most recently reviewed this work at the Helsinki meeting, which was last November, so like 4 months ago.
So I'll also say, Jonathan, so this paper actually started, at the Polar Data Planning Summit. And so that was an NSF funded activity, but had other contributions as well. And I think the important step here in terms of our community building and activities was, this is where we started shifting away from strictly having, a conference style meetings, as we had with the, the Polar Data Forum 2, and, IPY events were often, meetings where we just presented and so on. And this one started moving us towards the working group style of activity. So I think it was an important sort of point in our development there. And it definitely brought in more than the usual suspects. There were a number of people there who had not engaged with us beforehand. So anyway, that was the May 2018 meeting.
Okay, so there are, I think, a total of 20 recommendations in here. And I suspect that many of them will sound familiar or to a lot of people, or maybe even like just common sense. For example, all metadata records should contain documentation of what profiles are used to create metadata records. This is addressing the issue that you can say something is ISO 19115, but whose ISO 19115 and which flavor of it? Because there are enough different that they're not interoperable without a lot of work. And secondly, a lot of discussion and agreement has come about around the whole concept of validators. In other words, it's one thing for a data center to say, hi, we're ISO 19115. I'm going to pick on that. Sorry, it's just, compliant, but unless there's some common standard recommended validator for that, you don't know how compliant that really is. And they're beginning to be validators for not just metadata standards, but also for web services and that sort of thing. And those are very valuable, because then a place that's trying to implement some particular standard or trying to make sure that their services are compliant with some particular standard have a way of knowing how close they are to hitting that mark. And so it even includes a couple of validators that exist. There was strong agreement at all of those meetings, well, at least the last two, that schema.org was a very lightweight way of advertising data sets and repositories, and that was something that everybody thought they could actually implement. And so this recommendation 4 is about placing schema.org metadata on landing pages for data sets, and that they should follow the most recent recommendations of the EarthCube projects to ensure consistency in how it's implemented. EarthCube and ESIP are the groups that started the Science on Schema.org guidance in this regard. So that's sort of the heritage of the Schema.org geoscience extensions and how to use that. There's a lot of discussion about identifiers and the need to ensure that the persistent identifiers fulfill their function by whomever the originating data center is who applies a DOI or other persistent identifier to data. No matter who aggregates that metadata or how many copies of that data exist, that DOI needs to accompany that data on its travels. And while other groups might have their own identifiers that they assign to whatever comes in, the primary one is the original one. And you can have more than one in your schema.org record, but you need to keep that first one going, because otherwise you end up with a situation where you don't know if this data set is the same as that one or not. And so that's been a problem historically. And then and then wherever there are persistent identifiers for other components of a metadata record, like for people, projects, instruments, you name it, you should use those in the schema.org markup, because those persistent identifiers will allow you to trace, you know, for example, how many data sets, you know, came out of such and such institution, or were associated with you know, a person or a group of people or an organization, or those sorts of things. And that allows the sort of web of interconnectedness of all research kinds of products to be something that's approachable, which, you know, for a long time it really hasn't been that approachable. It talks about data integrity in regards to validating holdings, so that people know that they're getting what they thought they were getting, and that the repository knows when or if some problem has happened with a data set and it no longer is what it says it is. And there was several statements about semantics and the use of publicly accessible community consensus vocabularies and ontologies where they exist, and not reinventing the wheel, because reinventing the wheel is something that is currently happening. And as Pierluigi in the last session noted, a lot of time what happens is, for a particular project, people invent an ontology. They talk about it in a paper. They don't make it publicly available. And then it sort of disappears when that project goes away. So it actually doesn't have a lasting impact. And then there's some issues about access, particularly not for the long tail of data, but for a lot of the large data sets that are multi-terabyte, multi-petabyte in size, and making services available to make it reasonable for people to access or subset or those data. And along with that, you know, the whole issue of, great, if you spin up a web service, but do you change its URL every month as you update your data center's catalog? That doesn't help, because nobody can use those services if they keep moving and breaking. So that has to do with quality of services and validation and service status. So there's several of those kind of recommendations.
So Ruth, we could probably just sort of continue on. Just wanted to give people a sense of how this came together in terms of the community aspects,
okay,
et cetera. And so I do want to get thoughts. Your thoughts in terms of this process, the strengths, weaknesses, anything related to sort of the community building aspect and engagement.
Well, I think this has been a good exercise. I will say that each of the 3 places where this happened had slightly different communities, though typically there were like 30 or 40 people participating. My big concern about this is that getting something to a point where you can actually, publish it in those circumstances is interesting. Not a lot of people in the data management community don't get any rewards for publishing anything. And so that, makes getting a paper even together a bit challenging. But on the other hand, we've now got it together, and it would be good if this community sort of could vet it. I'd be happy to put a link to it in the chat if anybody wants to review or has anything major to add.
Okay. Great. Thank you for that, Ruth. Any other thoughts? This idea of the process has come up. We've talked about it in previous sessions here. There was an IARPIC meeting actually that a few of us were attended a few weeks back as well about how we're working as a community, engaging or not engaging, and so on. So I want to just put it out there for people's general ideas, thoughts on what's working, what's not working, what we might be doing.
Not directly related to the paper, but to the other work, what are the technologies in use and who's harvesting from whom, etc. I think it's important to keep that going, and that actually was one of the recommendations in the paper, is that needs to be publicly available, and people need to be able to update it as their systems change, because it's very useful for other people and other repositories to see what everybody else is doing, and perhaps to encourage coalescence around doing things more the same way. Just throw that out there. It's not clear to me how that can happen, but Peter, I know that you're working towards that to some extent with CCADI, I believe. But personally, I think that's a good goal.
Okay, great. I see that Michael Brady has his hand raised. Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks. How you doing, Peter? Thank you. So maybe turning this, I'm going to say some comments and then maybe turning it into a question for you in the group. In the ecosystem of partnerships that you've described earlier, and we hear a lot about, I'm wondering what the health is with the linkages with national and international programs specifically. And I'll submit one that I think should be considered for future collaborations. And I'm wondering if there are interactions now, or there are plans to have interactions with hydrographic authorities in nation states. A good forum is the International Hydrographic Organization. It's been around for over 100 years. They're a standards-based organization. Their primary mission is to support safety of navigation by sea and protection of the marine environment. Currently, they're primarily focused on getting at the protection of the marine environment now through safety navigation, so things like avoiding disasters by ship. But there is this broader goal of protection of the marine environment. I think this is a strong linkage with Arctic Council interests, and there's a lot of engagement with payment and other groups that support the Arctic Council. They do lots of capacity building efforts. One of their main kind of governance topic that brings together groups, particularly nation states, is their marine spatial data infrastructure efforts. And in this realm, they do lots of capacity building efforts. So visiting with nation states that don't have strong hydrographic offices, that we do, there's training that happens to build that capacity. I think that capacity building topic is something that's been coming up a lot in this user-centered topic of under the broader theme of actionable Arctic observing system. So I think there's a nice way to start conversations there, the capacity building efforts between these groups. And I also want to mention, there's a lot to mention we can follow up on here with an incredible amount of linkages that I think, just what I'm hearing from you, and the same kind of things, hackathons, very similar things happening with the International Hydrographic Organization and related activities. I do want to mention that so a little background, the IHO is broken up into regional commissions and relatively new ones, a few years old. The Arctic specifically has a regional commission, so they kind of to orchestrate and organize engagements with Arctic states in particular on hydrographic product development, including bathymetry. This is a big topic, and big cross-cutting topic that they engage with. So the Arctic in particular, somewhat different than the rest of the commissions, they're particularly focused on engaging local communities. So I do want to highlight one meeting that's coming up, or hopefully coming up. We'll see if it comes up perhaps in a virtual forum. It's meant to be in person in Nome, Alaska, in collaboration, NOAA, U.S. Department of Defense, UCAR, and the Alaska ESCO Whaling Commission. So they're going to get together and talk about, hydrographic needs, so charting needs, and including the local perspective, which is where I suspect we may need some unique expertise. I know, Peter, you in particular you work a lot on mediation and semantics. I think this is something that would probably need some, tapping into expertise. So I suspect that those national perspectives will, it's kind of a really a difficult boundary to cross when you get into those local communities in the Arctic. So I think there's this incredible need for bringing in a lot of the sophisticated work that this group does, building that kind of grassroots capacity. And I do realize that I'm talking too much, but I do want to highlight another effort that I think might be a concrete way to begin engaging the IHO, particularly with US office. They do the Ocean Coastal Survey, who chairs the Arctic Regional Hydrographic Commission. This is Rear Admiral Smith with NOAA. There's a program that's trying to get legs under his lead, that commission, on crowdsourced bathymetry. Something that it's this technical and legal barriers to actually doing that, to dealing with national hydrographic organizations. But the kind of one of the international effort that is organized around is Seabed 2030, which is kind of connects with UN goals, development goals. How do we, get the world charted to modern standards? Polar region being particularly challenging. Crowdsourced bathymetry has particular added value in that realm. Now, one other kind of guiding principle that we look to, many nation states look to, is the UN GGIM, United Nations Global Geospatial Information Management. Again, lots of their focus is on user-centered design and building national capacities, GIS offices, to produce and leverage hydrographic information and other kinds of GIS. I'll leave it there with a lot. We can follow up on that, but just wanted to submit that as a potential new avenue for new partnerships, particularly nation international. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michael. That's all excellent. I'll just touch quickly on a couple of the points and questions that you put out there. With respect to your first point about national engagement, what we've been trying to do is to find key national points of contact. And so many of the partners that were sort of in that logo cloud and so on are coming from national agencies. Many countries, not all, certainly not Canada and not really the US, but many countries have a polar institute. So we'll have their representation. And the idea is that they then, bring to the table, connections to their national initiatives. So that's the kind of thing, when I'm not wearing my chair hat for Arctic Data Committee, Shannon and I and some others at Arctic Data Committee, tell people about what's happening in Canada. And we have Norwegians who do that, et cetera. So that's one mechanism. It's not perfect, primarily because what we've realized is that no national representative can really know everything that's going on in a particular country. And that's why when we did the charter or the terms of reference for the data committee, we didn't say there could only be one, national representative or two. It's a national representative plus anybody who's interested in and engaged. And what we found is that's really helped us, because we end up getting some people who work in different areas within a country coming to the table. The biggest issue, though, and we'll come back to this, is capacity, is just the capacity for those representatives to sort of contribute, given that they have day jobs, etc. The IHO is a great one. What we've done with IHO so far has been through an intermediary in the form of the Arctic Spatial Data Infrastructure. So there's a group that you're probably familiar with, Arctic SDI, particularly folks in Europe. There's some in the US and in Canada, Cameron Wilson and his group at Natural Resources Canada. So they've been working really closely with IHO and the IHO SDI initiatives and so on. So we do get reports back from them, but again, it's an imperfect model in that, for a number of practical reasons, mostly just time and travel, we don't tend to have IHO representatives directly at the table. So I'll leave it there, because I want to sort of put that out there for thoughts, ideas, discussion around how can we maybe facilitate getting those more direct connections. Is something like an Arctic Data Committee or these meetings we've been having the right venue? Are there other tables that we should be at that can be efficient as well? Because people like that are part of our committee, again, this isn't entirely what they do. So going to each and every meeting of all the different groups isn't practical, but maybe there are fora that we could identify that would help make these connections.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent. And I'll just ask you, unless it's a new, just to lower your hand, just so we can track ideas. Okay, other thoughts?
I must have missed, oh, I see the button. Okay, sorry. There you go.
Okay, there we go.
Hi, this is Jonathan. Can you hear
Hi,
me?
Jonathan, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. The following on Ruth's white paper presentation, this brings to mind introductory biology class. This concept of the central dogma. In that context, that's the way that the genetic material is encoded in biology. I think we've got a similar central dogma for data management, and there's some level of consensus, and across the community, I'm hearing this from various angles. So it's good. We're recognizing it. We just have to treat it with, give it, if we name it, if we put a proper name on it, I think we know how to handle it moving forward.
Can you elaborate? So what are you seeing? What gives the label of dogma to it? Dogma typically isn't something that people put forward with positive connotations. So maybe if you could unpack that a little.
Yeah, if you're not trained as a biologist, you might not see the positive connotations to it. But in science, what we do is we, set up straw men. We might understand, basic fundamentals that everybody needs to agree to. But then the interesting questions come up around the edges. So, and I've seen this from a number of different perspectives, that there's a strong tendency towards consensus building, and it's this isn't groundbreaking research. This is well covered material, and we need to just contrast that with what are the areas where we can grow as a scientific area, data science. What are areas for refinement and improvement? And the central dogma would be the things that are kind of accepted, and you know, we need to teach people. It's not that, you know, this is an educational activity. So once people get up to speed, become educated in best practices, or whatever we want to call it, then we can go on and tackle the important problems of the day.
Thanks. That's great elaboration. And I think, yeah, I think that fits to some extent with the model that we're seeing. So definitely, you know, as the paper sort of suggests, when, you know, certain sub communities get together, or you know, members of the community get together, we're sort of working towards that, particularly in reaching out to the research community, and then also to, you know, actual communities on the ground. Although what I think I've seen through a lot of this over time is that, you know, we have these discussions as a group, but each member of the group has various activities that they're involved in that probably are along the edges that you're talking about. But as you point out, I think it's just very valuable, is there's that sort of central part, the overlap, where people are saying, yeah, these are the core things that we're all talking about together. Any thoughts in terms of how you might see things going forward in terms of, you know, post dogma, or building on the dogma that you point out, in terms of, you know, those edges, like where, you know, where we improve on moving forward on the edges?
I think in a way the whole Arctic is an edge case. It's on the edge of the world, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and this is where we often talk about, we again and again, pretty much every time I get together with a group, we ask this question or two: is should we even be doing this as an Arctic endeavor or as a polar endeavor? And I know some folks who aren't necessarily on the line right now. We've had some really good and interesting conversations about it, and we always come back to, in some ways, no, because some of these topics, you know, the paper that Ruth put up, most of those things said are sort of not Arctic specific. However, when you look at it, we do have a whole bunch of things that come together that make it an edge case. You know, the things that we've talked about, the actual environment that we're working in, and that intersects with observing, but also the interdisciplinary nature of the community, because we are regionally defined, not a domain specific or discipline specific. And then also things like actually working, you know, increasingly together with the communities on the ground. And so, yeah, I think all of that puts us in an interesting space, but, you know, a challenging one as well. Okay.
Yeah, so if I could interject there. So I think it's something like I'm working with some of the genomics communities in the Antarctic. One of the things that's remarkable about that is that it's a relatively small community doing this stuff. So when we talk about these big global principles about best practices for management of the data or the methods, they can actually implement it pretty quickly because they all know each other quite well. So, I mean, I know the Arctic is more complicated in many ways, but in some cases, it's likely to be there's a smaller group of people able to actually implement some of these global recommendations with regional variations that can be justified, of course. So I think, you know, if we're all involved in some of those global initiatives, and if we can find or motivate with the smaller team here a kind of Arctic demonstration of those things in practice with variations that are necessary due to the context of the Arctic, I think that will increase its visibility and also help build that system in alignment with the global principles.
Thank you. I think that's really important, and it's something that we, again, have been talking about for a number of years now and making attempts. You came up yesterday too, ideas of use cases, focused efforts, et cetera, and I think that's where we really need to keep going. It's great to have the principles, and it's great to try and work together, but to say that we're going to try and tackle this all in one big effort that's going to involve everybody, it just isn't very practical. And sometimes I think during IPY that was more, not necessarily the vision, but I think more the expectation is that's how we would do it. And now I think we're really getting ground truth here to say, okay, going forward under common visions and dogma, as Jonathan would say, but also taking off these small chunks. So the question we have, and this relates actually to many other working groups in the AOS, is how do we then work together beyond the data community? And this came up yesterday, of making sure that we're not siloed, that the data participants, the data community, are part of a larger working group or a team that is moving forward, not sitting off just in their own space.
Peter, I'm sorry, are we using raised hands?
If you can, but if not, just jump in. We got a relatively small group, so.
I don't see a raised hand, so I'll jump in. One, just to follow on this dogma theme, it also presents barriers if you have a community with a strong central dogma and you're trying to interact with another discipline that does not have that shared dogma. I don't know if I can draw any more inference from looking at the biology example and how that affects, but biology is a very siloed discipline. Okay, they don't interact well with physicists, or for example. I mean, that's probably been changing a lot, but all I'm saying is these are disciplinary barriers that by design, and you have to kind of go to school, get training to be indoctrinated, and maybe we should just be aware of that, and then really look at the dogma and say, well, what in the Arctic do we really need? Given what's realistic in terms of capacity, the organizations and funding that's available, and maybe push back on that dogma some and say, here's the one that we absolutely need, that's absolutely required for Arctic communities.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach. Basically, generally just being reflexive on what we're doing. What I think is interesting in our context is that because we're not coming from a disciplinary perspective, we probably don't, the community as a whole probably does not have a strong dogma. The data community may, the sort of data science members, because we're sort of, have these best practices, et cetera, that we're working towards, that we're talking about, the data documentation, persistent identifiers, and so on, that are part of this global movement. So I think the question is, as we go forward, given that that's relatively new, it certainly wasn't part in any way of my training, for example, but it's something that I think is evolving. And yeah, how does that sort of data dogma fit within the larger research and then within communities? And I certainly know in the work that I do in communities, there are parts of it that are relevant and important, but other parts that are less of interest to that particular community. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, so perhaps building on this issue of dogma silos, One kind of solution perhaps that we've been hearing about under the AOS 2020, under this larger theme, actionability, is the role of boundary spanning organizations. So those that kind of help bridge those silos, the silo between producer and user, in this case, stakeholder, being particularly salient and for actionable data and information and knowledge. So similar question as before, in the spirit of actionability. I wonder the group's thoughts on the health of this community, this data community, with local community decision makers. Boundary organizations, you have particular cases where there's strong connections with local community managers and residents through boundary organizations. I know in the United States, we, in the US Arctic, we had something called landscape conservation cooperatives, which filled that role of boundary organization. And through recent budget cuts, NOAA Sea Grant programs were on the chopping block, and it looks like landscape conservation cooperatives kind of suffered through this period of budget cuts for those kind of seemingly non-essential services. So I'm wondering elsewhere in Canada, I know that they, and my perception is that Canada does this kind of boundary spanning work with local communities particularly well. And many of us can learn a great deal from Canada. It's my particular interest to try to bring some of those insights to some of the US dealings in terms of actionable engagements. So best practices, what are some of the boundary organizations that this community is either engaged with now or actively trying to engage with? One international one perhaps that I'm aware of, perhaps to bring into this conversation, is the American Geophysical Union has something called Thriving Earth Exchange. I'm sure some here have heard of this. I think in theory, what they're doing is great. I, as someone that considers myself, or at least one point, a practitioner trying to do this kind of boundary work, I found it surprisingly challenging to engage with AGU Thriving Earth Exchange. So I wonder if others have experience with that group, engaging local communities. So best practices, boundary organizations.
Yeah, and this comes back to some academic work that I and many others have done. Mark Parsons, I know, has done some writing around this too, is coming out of Susan Lee Starr's work many years ago on boundary objects, and the idea of a boundary object, this entity, whether it be an organization or something else. The work I've done is on the map, and the map is a boundary object that many actors, I'll call it, not stakeholders, but actors, can come around, and it's a place where people can meet and people can interact and so on. So I think you bring up some really excellent points, and one of the things that we're grappling with, or really trying to deal with at this international scale that we're talking about now, is, what's the balance there? How do we do that? Knowing that at the international scale, you've named a number in the US, as you point out, there are some in Canada, I know there are some in Norway, et cetera. What's the approach to connecting to those boundary objects given the international scale? And we've had some success, I think. ADC for the Arctic and data has become a boundary organization at just bringing groups together. We haven't had great success in bringing together Indigenous organizations, although we're working on that. A lot of that has been just the capacity for those organizations to engage, but also, and I can't speak for them, but the question would be, to what extent is it just, it's not the top priority, and I could definitely recognize that. And is this the most interesting kind of boundary organization or level for those organizations to work in? So I don't know, I see Alan is on the call, Alan Pope, who is Executive Secretary of IASC, and I think we probably have some similar sort of overlap here of this sort of bridging from the international down to regional and national, and how we practically make those connections. So any thoughts that people have on that would be useful.
So just to clarify, Peter, my question is really about the local communities So are you working with any particular local communities and role of any mediary?
So then that's sort of what I'm trying to point out is when you say you or the community, at the international level, likely not, because we don't have a secretariat, for example. We don't have an organization. We have a community. And so I would say the answer is yes, because we have many people in the community or organizations in the community who are working with communities. But you bring sort of a philosophical question we brought up many times too, is who is we, what is it in terms of the community, you know, the data community. So I don't want to evade your question or be evasive with your question, but it's sort of a practical issue of, you know, who and how would we engage. And what we've tended to do is we bring to the table people who are doing that through their work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, just so I'm understanding. So part of this community, this data community, includes individuals and groups that are actively working with local residences in places that would realize the benefits from these data coordination activities.
Yes. Now, do we have everybody we'd like to have around the table? Sometimes not, mostly not, but you know, it also, the community sort of expands and contracts depending on the venue, the meeting, etc. But yeah, we have a number of people, organizations. You know, I lead a project called ALOCA, the Exchange for Local Observations of Knowledge of the Arctic in the US. I'm just sort of phasing out of that. And then, you know, the work that I do under my new institution at Carleton University, I spent 15 years working with Indigenous communities. And when I'm not doing this stuff, I'm mostly working directly in communities. But that's sort of me as an individual, you know, coming to the table as a member of the community. And so this is where I think this idea of the community is an amorphous kind of thing that is in some ways best represented by just some of the images that I put up at the beginning. It's that logo cloud, it's the picture of the meetings and so on, but we don't have this central entity that is the community. Or at least that's my thinking on it, but others, there are a number of people online who could probably throw out some ideas there as well.
Yeah, and just I'd like to keep it on topic if possible, because I think this is critical to the theme actionable observing systems, and a strong linkage to what Sandy Starkweather and others have been talking about with these stakeholder-driven observing network optimization approaches, where the user, the stakeholder is at the center of identifying the essential variables and priorities that would then organize these observing systems. And that structured facilitation that Sandy has been talking about as the process for getting those priorities visible to the communities, primarily scientists that would be communicating those observing priorities to the decision makers. I think it's critical when thinking about expanding communities like this. I think the data community in particular could play a central role in establishing those connections with the user. In this case, I'm thinking decision makers, so managers, local residents in local communities. How can we, in a structured way, engage them? I think around data, viewing data itself as a boundary object, you know, through the process of semantics, you know, identifying interoperable language is one example of how data particularly can play a role in communicating across with the local stakeholders, decision makers, and identifying making more visible those data needs to the broader community. So I think that I'm thinking data as the boundary object that can really help this larger observing community. And if I didn't articulate that clearly enough, I would need more time.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I think that really hits on what we talked about yesterday as well, which is we for good reasons have times when it's really productive and useful to have the data community sort of meet together to, you know, have their meetings to work on, you know, what they need to work on. But it's not very productive to strictly do that or to exclusively do that. So we're working towards, and you mentioned, Sandy, and, that effort, making sure that the members of the data community are directly at that table. And not just the data community, but, it came up yesterday in Working Group 1 as well, who needs to be at the table. And so a few of us went over to that session at the end of ours and said, yeah, I think we need to make sure, in addition to community members, in addition to researchers, policymakers, we need to have data folks at that table. And that'll, if nothing else, it's more efficient. So you don't have the sort of the water carriers who are having to say, oh, this is what the data people are talking about, it's relevant to this. And also, I just think, as you point out, data is a boundary object. And if you saw Sandy's diagram yesterday in her presentation, it's sort of that cross-cutting thing at the bottom of the diagram, where she had the various working groups mapped out against different themes and so on. So yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, what you're saying. And what we're trying to do here, I think, is if we can start moving towards that more efficient model, it'd be much more effective as well.
Last comment, 'cause I think this is critical. With respect to building the community, what are views on prioritizing? How do we engage decision makers, policymakers with data products to inform the kinds of data coordination that we do writ large? So how do we proactively engage the user communities that would be the avenue towards realizing the societal benefits that we talk about, bringing in those stakeholder perspectives? How do we bring those perspectives into the table when we ourselves are at the table?
Yeah, and I'll just throw out a couple points and open up the floor here, because I think these are all really good points and questions. Again, that probably comes down to making it something pragmatic. So it didn't get going due to the change in administration, but a few years back, we were looking, for example, at using IARPIC in the US, because we had people who were literally sitting in the White House and so on, who we were working with, and to try and create something that's sort of a practical, implementable project that would allow us to start working towards that. So I'll stop there and put out to the floor for comments and questions related to this topic.
And just a plug, the IARPIC, Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee Arctic Data Subteam, supports the environmental intelligence. Interagency team is myself in collaboration with Jonathan Blythe on this call. We're looking to expand on this user-centered approach to basically use these monthly calls to bring together user voices into these interagency conversations. So, thanks for the plug.
Great, thank you for that, Ruth.
I think this all goes directly to the capacity issue. Data people generally are not tasked to do this kind of work, or not funded to do this kind of work. For example, this is not anything that it pays me anything. And so I hesitate to commit to doing, actually even as much as I currently am doing. Just because, yeah?
No, sorry, go ahead.
So I think that has to be taken into consideration. I mean, at this point, data may be rising to people's, attention, but it is not something that is typically well-funded. For example, I have, actually I was there at this beginning of the AGU group that Raj is running. And, they came in with very naive perceptions about, what it means to work with communities, etc. And we don't have the structures in place to actually fund a lot of that kind of work. Because if you're going to work with communities, you can't have a 2-year grant and then, you know, at the end of the grant, you abandon the community. I mean, that just isn't going to fly. And so we don't have the mechanisms in place to allow the people who are funded as data people to actually do a lot of that work unless they do it on their own time. And I guess I in particular, and I know of others who are getting kind of tired of the, if it's important and should be done, it can't be funded paradigm that currently exists.
Thank you, Ruth. I think those are all good points. And the last point, I don't have the slide up anymore, but was around this capacity idea. One thing I would put out, and this relates to some of Jonathan's comments, I think, as well, is that I think we're seeing an evolution here, or sort of you know, a development over time of you know, what we do in our communities. I would argue before International Polar Year, we didn't have much of a community as such. We had a lot of people doing things. You know, they were interested in each other's work, but it was mainly through publications. We weren't getting together. Through IPY, and particularly the work that Taco and Mark did, along with many others, you know, that started to bring us together as a community of data practitioners. That's taken time. It's taken about a decade, and I think we've done some additional work since then to do that. And now we actually have, I think, a group that we can call, or we tend to call it, the Arctic or Polar Data Community. And we know who the people are, who the organizations are. And now we're moving into this next transition of, okay, how do we connect that community that we can now identify as an entity to the actual end users, to stakeholders, to rights holders, and others, and then start, you know, working together. And we're in this transition phase, though, where, as Ruth points out, you know, the model's not quite there yet. It's changing, certainly, since I've, you know, in the last 10 years, we now see, you know, an NSF proposal requires a data management plan. You can actually put, you know, resources in for the data management, but often there's a bit of a disconnect with what needs to happen when you have these tables and these projects and what we have the resources for. So the question, I think, here is, yeah, how do we keep that moving forward to a model that can actually work, you know, better than it is now? I think we're making really good progress, but we're not quite there. So other thoughts on that, the idea of capacity and so on?
So Peter, just a comment, you mentioned National Science Foundation. I'm sure others are aware. The new Navigating the New Arctic program requires proposers to explain their strategy for engaging local communities if they plan on traveling nearby those communities in the process of doing their science. I think this is you know, potentially not perfect, but it does provide like a procedural check in with the scientists when they're thinking about doing their research, to think about how they're going to incorporate the communities that they may engage in the process of doing the research. And I think that is one huge step towards incentivizing the engagement. So capacity building, I agree with everything Ruth said. Capacity is lacking, the incentives are lacking. And what strikes me is, you know, if we're looking towards societal benefits and actionability, and to get there, it's required that the end users be involved in the process of designing these decision support tools, then why aren't the incentives there? It's incredibly, it's obviously the next step, that we communicate the importance of those incentives for building capacity for those engagements with our users.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and there are some parallels that's alluded to in the chat window here as well with you know, communities in the Arctic, in that often I've seen it. I mean, there are many papers written on it. Working Group 3, I'm sure, is talking about it. Is often you know, the idea is, let's engage with the community, call them up. You arrive in the community, we'd like to speak with you. But there's no compensation for that. There's no value proposition. There is value in the sense that they can share, you know, what their priorities are and so on. But if you have, 15 scientists showing up in a community, which is not unreasonable in some communities, in a week or two, that's time that they have to spend. And I think it's a bit of a parallel with the data community is, people have their day jobs. We will all want to do this collaborative work. We all want to engage, but there's not always sort of the direct incentives. And you get, in the communities, it's referred to as research fatigue. And there's definitely a lot written about and a lot discussed about that now. So it's figuring out how to do that in a respectful and a practical way. Because for some of us who've been working, with communities for, let's say, I think in my case, about 15 years, this wasn't a topic of discussion even maybe 5 or 7 years ago. Now it's a huge topic of discussion, the engagement and so on, but we have to figure out how to manage that. So that's more of, I think, a working group 3 discussion as well, like the specifics of interacting with communities. We have a lot of Indigenous organizations who are working now and so on. But we do need to think about it for the data practitioners and the data community engagement as well. So some others, are there others on the call who've not contributed or who've not said anything who might want to speak about this community building, resourcing, capacity building within the community and so on?
Hey there, this is Alan. I don't have anything to share, but more have a question than anything else. So hopefully it doesn't derail things. Let me know if it does. Thinking about some of the conversations I heard yesterday about this, like you say, building community, and that this is a very diverse community, right, with lots of different subsets, but that we're trying to, or that it's trying to support and change how certain research practices get done. So there's a lot of that. So why should I care sort of question coming from the research community, I feel like, or the, okay, but what does that mean for me sort of thing? And I wonder, is there a way to facilitate or help make those conversations more, I guess, regular sorts of conversations and discussions, recognizing totally what Ruth was saying about the data building, data community building being something that's under-resourced, but that researchers also feel that like the support that they have to do the data work and things like that is also under-resourced. So yeah, that's a question more than anything else. I don't know if it's a good one, but.
No, I think it's a great one, and it really hits the nail on the head, is that I think in general, this area of data management is under-resourced, both at the researcher level. Great, you get 10% of a person. What does that do for you practically, right? You can't hire 1/10 of a person. And what I find, I think your point, Alan, too, the real challenge for me that we're facing here is the scale issue. I find it quite practical actually to make progress at my project and my national level even, because we're funded to do so. So this initiative I mentioned, CCADI, we have bodies, we have full-time 100% FTE people now who can respond to a scientist and who can sit down with them for 2 days and say, we're helping you. I've got a call on Friday with permafrost people. How are we going to work with you directly? We don't have that at the international level. So if an IASC working group says, hey, can we do this? Can we have you sit down and tell us, what's going to be beneficial, to T-Mosaic, for example. We're trying to live through that now, but we don't have those people, really funded to do that. So we're doing it because it's important and we're figuring out ways to do it, but it's imperfect because at that international level, as we all know, it's very hard to resource stuff. So I think it's valuable to do it at the local level and at the national level, but it leaves that sort of gap up here where we're working at the international. That's my thinking anyway, as one of our key challenges, not only for data, but for the integrated Arctic observing system, for Arctic science, for Arctic communities as a whole. So thank you for that. And I don't know if you have any reflections on my response or others as well.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that, and part of this is coming from my, I think, experience within the US research community that I'm not sure even nationally there it feels particularly well handled or resourced. And maybe it's because it felt more dispersed without, you know, one central point of contact. You noted earlier, like there's not a Polar Research Institute in the US, for example. And maybe that's some of it, that there is also fracturing there, and increasingly more and more organizations to build those networks, for sure.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly say this and then go to Jonathan, who has his hand up. The US, I don't know if it's an entirely unique case, but it's a pretty special case in terms of its complexity. And the reason I took on the role that Jonathan and Michael are now doing of the ADST IARPIC lead was to try to see if that could be that focal point. Because I looked around and I said, wow, how am I going to manage this in terms of connecting the US community to the international? And that seemed to be a body that might work. Jonathan, go ahead.
There's a chat that I wanted to respond to. Tatiana writes that this person raised the issue of local communities' property on data. And what I'm aware of that's a very important issue and still needs to be fully appreciated by the data community is the issue of licensing of data. And so I don't know if that's part of a solution, but with a license, that's a legal mechanism, which can involve transfer of funds. It can involve restrictions. You usually want restrictions for to protect data if it's sensitive, for example. You want to put restrictions if you don't want people using it in a particular way. So because the data community has not fully embraced the issue of licensing, I think this is perhaps an area that we need to explore and see if it can be used in a creative way to help solve some of these challenges, these capacity challenges. Because licensing is fundamentally a way to recognize intellectual property and the investment that people have made, perhaps data managers in data that they're currently not getting compensated for.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that. And that probably opens up another discussion too about things like open data, but also in the chat, I just pointed out that with respect to Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous data, there's a huge amount of work that's going on in this area right now. I mentioned in one of my initial presentations yesterday, the new CARE principles. Stephanie Russo-Carroll, I invited her to speak as one of the keynotes for Arctic Observing Summit, so you can watch her talk. It's linked to the site. And it's a pretty complex space, so I'd welcome any comments on this. It goes a little bit away from community building, but I think it relates because it goes into one of those sort of approaches that links to things like capacity, like recognition, and all of that. The licensing, though, is an interesting question because where would people see that fit with the idea of open data, which is also we'll call I won't say dogma necessarily, but it's certainly been a movement within the science community over the last decade in particular.
I can comment on that a little bit. I'm representing the Arctic Data Center, which is the repository for data for the National Science Foundation here in the US. And we do have two different things, two different levels of licensing. We have CC0, which is you could use this at any point, and also CC BY, which is you can use this data as long as you attribute it to the original data author. We have found that any license that's more restrictive than that, like if you have to have a license where you contact the original PI, like, hey, can I use your data? That only has usefulness for not to get dark, but the lifespan of the researcher. So when that researcher retires, when that researcher changes institutions and may not be as easy to find, that data may become unusable. And in light of open data and making data accessible and archiving it for future use, licensing can present a problem in that way.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's sort of, I'm alluding, there's this is overall conversation movement that's been happening around, you know, the pros and cons of different types of licensing, et cetera, or, you know, making it CC0, said public domain, and that type of thing. So I've just put a link into the chat as well for any of you interested in the conversation related to Indigenous data sovereignty. There are a number of papers out there as well. And with respect to licensing, Jonathan, one of the things the lab I'm now a member of has done with some groups in Canada is looking at community-driven licensing that is based on Creative Commons and the CC system, but puts the sort of model into a way that the community gets to decide, you know, what can be done, what can't be done with the data, et cetera, as opposed to a research organization or a university and so on. So we have a white paper I can find and share as well. So. Okay, just coming back to the question around community building, interacting as a community. We've had some great inputs, I think, in terms of specific, you know, organizations, efforts that we might want to connect with. I think some good high-level conversation about some of the challenges, and we recognize, I think, some of the fundamental challenges do relate to capacity. So maybe there's a question there then as well, is what might we want to do about that? Can we do something at this international scale I mentioned that would help us there? I mean, we're making some good progress in that we're starting to see some funding, for example, although it's not a large amount, but it's helpful from IASC, for example, as the Arctic Data Committee now has a budget. So that sort of thing helps, but we've also talked in the past about things like a research coordination network grant, which is a US type of grant, but it can be used for international activities. Are there other things that are on people's minds about where we go with that, and should we be even doing that as an Arctic community, or should we be thinking about some other things like, you know, how do we engage more with RDA or other types of groups?
Peter, I guess my thoughts on this are that, you know, one of the reasons why I'm participating in this group is that this group has historically been getting stuff done. And that's the key thing. It's not clear to me if the NSF funding mechanisms are appropriate for, I mean, they do have the research coordination networks, but what we really want to have is a research coordination implementation kind of group, right? You know, where the international community that gets together because it exists because you've built it, and wants to do real things. The problem with coordination networks is that, you know, it funds workshops and telecons and that sort of stuff, but not so much in terms of people. And I think that's the real key to continuing to, quote, get stuff done, is figuring out some way of actually funding it. And I think that I was writing something on the federated data search.
Okay, I'll just touch quickly on a couple of points that you bring up. So I think our Geneva meeting was very good with respect. We had a set of principles that are in the report for that meeting, which said effectively that we're not going to be able to address this as a whole community all at once with some big massive grant that's going to get all the work done, but that we should try to continue working together as a community to highlight the priorities, establish what would be meaningful work from various perspectives, and then when we're writing our own grants, or when a small subgroup wants to get some work done, they would work together to try and resource that, but then link it back to the overall vision, the overall community, to help people understand what they're doing and how. So I think that's probably the most practical approach, and that's what we're doing now. So we see a number of funded projects that are moving forward on things. Where we seem to lack the resourcing is the glue money, as David Fick called it at a meeting a few years ago, which is how do we keep the people who are currently trying to keep the community together and working together moving forward. And I see your hand, Michael. I'll just quickly say, if Alan is still on, one thing I wanted to discuss with the IASC executive as well as the SAON executive is how do we start moving from individuals to institutions as well? Because right now we have a system that's really based on individuals and just calling upon people who are getting the work done. Not necessarily, we're not at a point yet where we can say this is an institution. So I'll go to Michael and then to Pierre.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So I'm mainly informed about U.S. Funding mechanisms. I think it was Ruth that mentioned that we need long-term dedicated support for these kinds of things. You can't just start a community engagement and have it end when the funding runs out. The structured funding mechanism that I'm aware of that is relevant here is long-term ecological research networks, LTERs. One of them in particular, a recent, now it's a couple years old, on the North Slope, was recently established for the Kaktovik area. So like by the Canada-US border on the northern Alaskan coast there. And they have that LTER, which is a long-term program. Generally, these LTRs are focused on ecosystem monitoring. So they're sustained assessments. But this one on the North Slope is unique because it explicitly has a component for community outreach and engagement. So how do we pull in the local communities, not only in the observing, but the analysis of the data and the products. Now, I haven't really seen any reporting on the LTER. I was really intrigued by it. I thought it was really innovative, really important, a really good potential best practice for these kinds of local community engagement. I haven't seen any reporting, but I suspect that, what usually happens is the social science aspects of these projects, especially working in such a complicated environment like that, I suspect that it's challenging. And I suspect that this group would need support by sophisticated, groups like this that are really keen on bringing in kind of grassroots expertise. So I would maybe put a question and then suggest that we look at some of these LTERs and see, are they looking to do community engagement in this new environment where the funders are really starting to hint that they want to see more of that.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Pierre.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think just picking up on Michael's point there. So I've worked with the LTER data managers through NC's, actually, NC's connections. And they have vocabularies in Thesauri too, but indeed within that network, there's still, I think, quite a lot of heterogeneity. So they face similar challenges, so it might be nice to reach out. But the point that I would like to raise is also that, yes, indeed, like it's an individual base, often it's kind of fragmented, but I reemphasize especially the training aspect. So if we have the next generation of PhD students or early career postdocs that are coming up, I'd be very interested to have as part of their supervisory committee or collaborator network, quite a lot of people either on this call or in this community to make sure that we can sync up. So like, again, that next generation is synced up by default and we learn about each other's activities through the work of our people. So I think if that's happening, if you're gathering up postdocs or PhD students, I certainly would be interested in syncing their work with ours.
Great, thank you, Pierre, and you'll be getting a call actually. You bring up a good point though, and I think it's one that links to what Ruth has said, is most of the people in our community, in our data community, are not actually practicing academics. And so I don't have, you know, an official paper on that or official stats, but I would say I'm probably one of the few people now, and that's only as of last July, that I have a faculty position. I think most of the other people engaging are working at a polar institute as a data manager, they're working at a scientific organization, or they're at a data center. But I think this is a really important point that you make, and something I've certainly been thinking about personally now too, is where can you have the biggest impact? And is it through education, like you said, so the next generation, you know, can carry this forward. So I'd be interested, yeah, in any other thoughts on that. But something that we've talked about in the past is sort of our education and capacity building activities, but usually that's fallen a bit flat because of, I think, the nature of our community, the membership of our community.
Yeah, so I think that's the thing to think, because it doesn't have to be students. It could be anyone that we're working with or guiding at some stage. But I'd have to learn a bit more about that world to be able to interface with it properly. But I think that's something for us to think about.
Yeah, a very good point.
I can add a bit more perspective on that. So the Arctic Data Center runs data science trainings. Usually we try to do them twice a year, and they're open to everyone who's active in Arctic research. Primarily, we try to get people who are National Science Foundation funded, but researchers, whether they're grad students, whether they're early career folks, whether they're, you know, someone who's pretty close to being emeritus, like everyone's able to access this data training. I threw the link in the chat if anyone's interested in taking a look at it, but we'd hope to see you there.
Yep, so we do have a few examples of that type of thing. And then the question is, how do we make that more systematic or more across the board, so that we can provide those resources, I think, to the community. So that's something I'm just noting for our statement as well. And we've made it, you know, many times over the years, but I think we need to just constantly reiterate these key points. Okay. I just want to come back. Tatiana had made a point, is in the chat, is about the federated search and the starting from the sites and what happens to the data, if I understand it correctly, you know, over the long term. So that came up a bit yesterday in some of our conversations, and you highlight a really important problem. So how do you make the data persistent? How do you ensure that it doesn't go from the local university journal and then sort of go away type thing? And so this is the thing, I think the biggest value of developing a community as opposed to just a collection of individual, you know, research centers or data centers or universities, so that there may be some redundancy or duplication that would allow, you know, maybe one group to take on this responsibility over time if the initial contributors are not able to do so, or if it sort of disappears from the system. So. And I'm just noting your comment, Alan. So yeah, recognizing it's a challenge, but what I'm seeing here is there is an I ask. So this is the thing, is that when Volker Rockhold left, you came in. We're moving towards that in the data community, and I think we just need to keep doing that, but it's a fragile system. And so just that idea of how do we move that forward so that, you know, if some person moves on or other, that you know that there's an entity there that will continue one way or the other. And so part of it comes back to that whole thing of the data and the observing and everybody being around the same table and saying, okay, this is part of the larger, I think, entity, the larger institution that needs to be sort of moved forward together, as opposed to sort of these sort of silos. And maybe, yeah, I'll go to Michael and then Jonathan and then come back to that if there's any comment on that.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to lower my hand. No comment.
Okay, and then Jonathan then?
Yeah, but back to the idea of tagging for sites. there's also a concept of where is this information applicable. So identifying, like in the case of oceanography, the sea name. So you get a, you know, something, a geographic reference for that sea name that could be cross-referenced. Other kinds of, you know, the national political boundaries the research was conducted in. All those things can help identify the place. And ultimately, if you're trying to reach local communities, they will recognize relevant data by its place, not necessarily by the tools, the portals that we use in the scientific community to aggregate or find and pull data together for a research question.
Okay, that's a good point. I think we need to note that in terms of if I'm understanding correctly, sort of the tagging and the identification, or yeah, I may not be fully understanding.
Yeah, so the problem I understood that Tatiana was bringing up is data that are poorly tagged. So when they are, say, registered in a search portal, you might not be able to quickly decipher what location they were collected in or where that information is applicable to. So I think if we, and I don't think that's part of the central dogma. That's you know, I was kind of putting a name on things. Yeah, generally we do have a recommendation for good metadata, but do the current metadata practices sufficiently identify the place-based nature of these collections?
Yeah, so I think that is touched on in the paper that Ruth was showing earlier on, and certainly as part of the discussion, I know, with the schema.org work and, well, all of the metadata work, I think. But as you point out, I don't think it's dogma or it's standard or it's you know, fully implemented practice across the board. So that's probably the issue there, is that, you know, what we talked about in this federated search, and Polder's been sort of discussing too, is there is no sort of consistent model that everybody's implementing that would have something like that in it. And I could be wrong, but Pierre.
Thanks. So I was really, like in various groups, I came across I think the European LTER network, or the ILTER, and they had a really cool service called DEAMS or DIMES, right? I'm putting the link in there. What I like about it is that it just leverages consistent metadata from each one of the sites inside the network, and that metadata is then used to generate a whole bunch of stuff, like the shape files. It's used to generate site information and sensor information and everything. So I think that's something cool to show. I mean, there are many examples. This is one I came across, but it seems to be pretty lightweight, that as long as all of the participating sites are delivering those sort of standardized metadata records, you can run some pretty cool services on top of it. If you go to their homepage, you'll see it's not just for sites, it's also for data sets and sensors and activities. So I think that's something to kind of use as an example and perhaps even emulate. Again, I'm not involved with that, so I don't know the details, but it seems like it could be really lightweight. All the sites or participants have to do is push a understandable, interoperable metadata record to the top, and it gets hoovered up, and then people can build all sorts of interfaces on top of it. So it opens up the market, so to speak.
Okay, thank you, Pierre.
And building on that, I will note that exactly is the reason for the recommendations related to validators and you know, the detailed specifications for what exactly should be in what fields. ISO 19115, for example, you know, it says that this field is X, but it doesn't really explain what X is. So many people have interpreted it in many different ways, and you know, there are even like a half a dozen different ways of specifying a DOI. So if you have validators that are saying things that, you know, you need to have a DOI or a PID of some sort. And if it's this kind of PID, this is the exact format we want. And there are validators for that. That is, I think, a good way of starting to motivate what peers talking about, because that's exactly the point of this science on schema data work guidance.
Thank you. Those are some good thoughts that fit within our federated search and discovery theme, and hopefully Tatiana some ideas related to your comment. I just want to quickly come back to the community building theme, collaboration, etc. I think we're probably getting to a point maybe where we've said what needs to be said, certainly for our statement. We've highlighted some of the key items, themes, etc. But before sort of wrapping that up, just wanted to see if there are any other thoughts out there that fit with that theme of working together as a community, what we may want to do, may not want to do, key issues, etc.
Peter, last comment from me. This is Mike. I think, I'm sure everyone here knows this, but I think it's important when we're talking about some of the constraints with place-based data. We know that much of that data can be sensitive. So, highlighting the role of Iloka and similar platforms that provide that kind of responsible and controlled organization of local ecological knowledge and local knowledge more generally. And maybe thinking about some of the constraints when talking about ways to access that kind of information. You're going to run into that social constraint of sovereignty over data and the important need for locals to protect that data. And then again, highlighting the role of responsible forums that control some of the access to that data.
Yep, that's an excellent point, Mike. And I think it's brought up in the IASC statement on principles of practices for Arctic data management that was published in 2013 at a very high level. And now, as I mentioned, we have things like the CARE principles and other very practical guidelines, at least, on how to do that. And it applies, as we point out in the IASC statement, not only to Indigenous knowledge, that's a key one, but also some social science data, some ecological data, and so on. And so these are always things that I think we have to be thinking about in terms of documenting and sharing the data. Okay, any other questions, comments? Okay, I think I'll leave that topic then. I have enough in terms of key points as we put together the statement later today, or start putting together the statement. And I would say I think we're in a very good position relative to where, again, we were 15 years ago, certainly. It's an evolution, and it's going to take time. So, we do need to keep working on it, but at the same time, we're making progress. So this is something that I think is important to recognize, knowing that we're not quite there yet. What I'd like to do then is, we still have an hour on our schedule, or just over an hour. Do people want to continue with any particular topic? As I said at the beginning of the session, we can talk about anything. We've just had some good productive conversation that relates more to the data discovery. Are there other topics that people want to address while we're on the line?
Peter, this is Mike. Maybe a discussion on what we're learning about the importance of virtualization. So one of the potential benefits of this pandemic that we're experiencing is that we're finding that a lot can be done virtually. I wouldn't have been able to participate in the AOS this year if it weren't done virtually. So just maybe touching on that theme, I suspect that that'll come out in the full report at the end as one of the themes, and maybe something to reflect on for future design of not only future AOS, but similar efforts to bring communities like this together.
Great, that's a good point. It's certainly something we talked about yesterday, and in very practical terms, we're looking at the next meeting for the federated search. I'll be going back to the Polder leadership. I'm not sure if Taco is still on. I don't think he is, but about having that meeting virtually. And then I haven't discussed this with Alan and the IASC and SEON folks yet, but I'm thinking about doing this given the situation for the fall Arctic Data Committee meeting as well. And I do think that if it's done well, done right, it can really be a productive way of moving forward, knowing that occasionally you do want to try and get that in-person connection as well. Alan, I see that you have your hand raised.
Yeah. If we're able to share any lessons learned from moving ASSW or AOS online, just let us know. But what I was actually going to say was building on the previous comment, was wondering whether, you know, people trying to work from home or people not necessarily being able to go out and collect new data from fieldwork, for example, this summer, do we think that that's going to change any, whether mindsets or practices around things like data reuse and going back to old data sets to be like, well, what's my summer project going to be? Or bringing users to data rather than data to users because people are worried about bandwidth at home rather than sitting in their offices or anything like that. Or is that, you know, too short term to be talking about, and, you know, the discussions here are more longer term rather than immediately responsive? Yeah, so curious.
I will just quickly say, I don't think it's too long term. There was a T-Mosaic executive meeting last week, and that was exactly what was said with respect to T-Mosaic, is that there would be more opportunity and that we should start to think about that in terms of that project and what people could be doing with existing data, given that the field season is not going to happen in the way it was planned. Jonathan.
Yeah, in our organization, we're looking at this as an opportunity to catch up on some backlog data management. At the same time, you just have to be careful because you don't know what people's situation are. So if you know, being sequestered in their home, they don't have access to their data or systems, or you know, or like me, have children, young children who they have to look after. There's just kind of going to be a large loss, I believe, from this this COVID situation, and it might be unrealistic to think that people are still going to be productive in other ways. So we should, just a word of caution. That's something we're struggling with as an organization. How do we make productive use of this time? And data is something you can do from home if you have an internet connection and a computer. But yeah, I just want to send that caution.
Yeah, fair point. Alan?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. And maybe that's not a question we should be asking. Well, for some people to consider now, for some people to consider in the summer, and hopefully increasingly more people, you know, in the future, but recognizing that this summer will have been a time where, and really just the entire next year, if there's no new data set from fieldwork for this summer or from this spring or whatever it is that people are doing research, that the impacts will hopefully be longer. Well, not that the impacts will hopefully be longer lived, but that the personal and social response will be wrapped up, and that people will then be able to focus again on research. But yeah, leading with compassion and not expecting productivity in a time where we're all under different stresses. Completely agree. Interesting to see what Erin is saying, is that there's an increase in data submissions over the last 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah, I was just about to talk about that. So of course it's still pretty early on in the pandemic, at least here in the US. Hopefully it's brief, but we all know how that works. We have been seeing an increase in submissions over the past 2 to 3 weeks, as I'm imagining researchers are like, oh, I have all this time, you know, quote unquote, to submit my data. But I think, Alan, your question about, you know, whether attitudes towards data reuse are going to change, and if Arctic researchers normally in the fields stuck at home this summer are going to take a look at older data sets. That's actually something I hadn't even considered, but I would love to take a look into that, especially with the holdings of the Arctic Data Center. So you've inspired me. I'm gonna keep an eye on our metrics. I'm gonna keep an eye on our downloads, compare it year over year, and hopefully I'll have some answers for you guys next time we chat.
So Aaron, this is Mike. For the first time in years, I actually looked at my Arctic Data Center submission and was going to reach out to see if I can update some of it. And that is due to me having time to kind of get back to old projects. But in terms of, so I'd be really curious for those doing social science research in remote places, if they've somehow figured out how to do some of their interviews remotely. I think that this is virtualization is an underutilized method, and clearly where there's you know, you're dealing with remote communities, especially in times when, you know, a lot of social science and other field work is seasonal. You know, the researchers show up when the weather's good and the, you know, hunters are out. I wonder if there's some good cases where social scientists are able to do some of their interviews virtually, and then make plans to do them on off seasons virtually. And, you know, thinking about the fact that the internet capacity is increasing in some of these remote locations. So be really curious to hear from social science that have moved their field work to where they're dealing with local communities and other stakeholders virtually.
So Mike, I'll just quickly say, you know, it's just my experience. This is not expected to be across the board, but at the moment, all of the work that we're doing with communities has stopped out of respect. The pandemic is really having an impact on communities, even if it hasn't hit the community yet. They're really focusing on making sure their healthcare systems are in place, and so on. So what we've done is, and there's travel ban in the Canadian Arctic essentially. So Nunavut, non-Nunavut residents are no longer allowed into the territory. The communities I work in have said they will not receive any visitors, but at the same time, they're also saying we need time to absorb this, and we'll get back to you. So in that one case, or, you know, case of one researcher, it's been, let's wait and see how this rolls out, and then, you know, that may be the case that it does turn into an opportunity, or it may be that they say, you know, we need to put this on hold for the moment. We'll have to see. Pierre.
Thanks. Again, I can't comment. So I hear Peter's points about working in the Arctic, and I can't comment about that and the constraints there. But so I work with a number of social scientists on a project in Germany that involves lots of interviews, and we used to have a series of workshops too. And what we've done is modify the Delphi process, the sort of iterative process of consensus building, to be a combination of one-on-one interviews that are run by a Zoom or any, you know, take your pick. And then at the end of those, we produce a kind of synthesis report, and then we have a collective call with the same participants, if they can join, to revise that and then come up with a consensus statement. So, you know, sort of tweaks to the existing approach that we'd have with that starts with one-on-one or very small groups, and then gradually, after we have a synthesis report that puts everyone on the same page, then having a collective meeting seems to work quite well. But again, the constraints in working in Arctic communities is something that Peter, of course, and others can guide more on.
Great, thank you. And I do think, despite the terrible situation that we're in, we may see some interesting evolution or changes in how we work, given what we're needing to do at the moment. So it'll be interesting space to track, not only for data folks, but also in general in communities with researchers, et cetera. Okay, are there any other questions or comments?
So just continuing that topic more generally, where people are figuring out what they can do from home, and this is requiring, not only, being exposed to platforms. Like I've been doing lots of Google Hangouts. I've never used Google Hangouts before all this. So we're all figuring out how to use those systems. And I think that we're building, in a sense, capacity to figure out what we can do from home. So while our the communities that we may be researching in, we don't want to add additional burden by reaching out to them for research projects during this time. They're also figuring out what they can do from home, and I do hope that there's efforts to increase their connection to virtual environments. With my agency, I know one thing we're doing, we're making lots of progress with figuring out what we can do for charting at home, so that we deal with a lot of limited distribution data. So it's, how do we work out the systems to allow us to remotely access some of these limited distribution data sets to continue our required production. So we have things that have to be done every week by law to get done. We previously were only doing it on systems that were kind of internal, that control these limited distribution data. So we're figuring out, we're actively building out the infrastructure so we can do it from home. And I imagine this is happening in many, many circles, and where we are building capacity for these virtual systems. And I think, in the context of community building, I think this is one topic that should get attention. Just really thinking about the capacity building that is happening and the role of virtualization in expanding the community, and as Pierre mentioned, continuity with connections, kind of using virtualization to augment in-person interactions.
Great, thank you, Michael. And just to Alan's offer of saying, let us know, how we can share the experience of ASSW and AOS. I do think going forward that there could be a really important role for IASC, SEON, IARC, and so on. Not necessarily IARC, sorry. The other groups that are organizing this could help facilitate this type of thing within the community, because I do know usually I'm on the hook when we're running something like this to do everything, to provide the Zoom channel, to do the chat monitoring, to make sure everything's running, do the scheduling, etc. It's been really amazing as a facilitator to have a team of people, or just even have one or two people supporting, to say, yeah, this is all in place. You need to focus on the content of the meeting, not so much running the meeting. So this could be something that, could have collective benefit for these international collaborative efforts, and recognizing there are resource limitations everywhere, but something maybe that could be discussed in sort of a debrief from the AOS, particularly around, follow-on meetings and so on.
Yeah, I was on a very meta Zoom call, which was an entire Zoom about organizing engaging Zoom events. It was very engaging in and of itself, but in case it's helpful, yeah, happy to talk individually, but I know that Federica and the local organizers were gonna work together to at least have some quick and dirty lessons learned out of this to get out there sooner rather than later for people doing brainstorming now. And we know there are lots of guides out there, but we also know people don't necessarily go looking for them if they're not, in the community that they're already in. So this is mostly going to be oriented towards Arctic, but I think a lot of the lessons learned are pretty widespread and not necessarily new things to people who've been doing these virtual ones. Yeah, thanks, Aaron, for posting the link there.
Yeah, and I would say, Alan, just as an anecdote, the Department of Geography at Carleton University is now using the AOS materials on how to engage in Zoom calls as part of a hiring process.
Cool.
I shared it, and they thought it was excellent. We have to do 6 interviews, full-day interviews with candidates, and they'll be using that as a template for guidance. So you're doing good in the world.
I'll tell Heather and the IARC team too.
Yeah, great. Any other questions, comments for this session? Actually, before I go to that, I'm going to just put in a plug for session 4 of Working Group 4, which is coming up, I think, in an hour and a half or a couple hours at 10:30 my time, 2:30 GMT. We want to focus there on emerging technologies, methods, and so on, including platforms. And this word has come out more related to communication platforms, but there's also analytical platforms, the whole idea of bring the code to the data type platforms, which may be helpful in the situation that we find ourselves in, because people may be able to be more productive than trying to download, gigabytes or terabytes worth of data from data centers to do work at home. So just something, if you're interested, come join us in that session. Pierre.
Thanks, Peter. So one thing that's a more high-level point of alignment that would be useful, I mentioned it a few times, this UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development coming up. So a number of us wrote the implementation guidance. It's a kind of like high-level guidance to help other people write implementation plans on the data infrastructure that's going to support the UN Decade. General principles, a lot of the things that we're all aligned on, I think. There was a webinar, so they had a global planning meeting that was scheduled, that was canceled. And now there's a webinar series where anyone can register and join and listen into. So if you have this if you want to be introduced to the implementation plans, and it's going to go through multiple things, not just the data theme, but other themes too. I'm pasting in a registration link. It might be interesting to listen into. And the implementation plans themselves, I guess, will be distributed or made available during those webinars. And you can read the data section and some of the thoughts that we had on how the data architecture for all of these nations and groups participating in this global thing should look like. And it's really high level. So it's mostly, again, that distributed system that's interoperable, et cetera, all of this sort of stuff. But that's something that we could perhaps leverage in the Arctic setting too, and in collaboration with the societal benefit areas and SAON and the roads process, to say that that's another point of alignment. And we can strengthen perhaps that emphasis on interoperability to help this working group's voice be heard a little bit louder.
Thank you, Pierre. Will this be a continuing series? I just note that the next one is tomorrow at 2 a.m. Eastern, which is a bit of a conflict, but yeah, it's just a bit of a conflict with AOS, but do you expect to have other ones, or do you know if there'll be others?
There will be a whole series on this for the whole global planning thing. So basically, one big global planning meeting that was several days long has now been broken up into a series of webinars. If you register for one, I believe, or you can add yourself to the mailing list for the decade, and they will inform you about upcoming webinars and what their topics will be. On the data side, again, you can reach out to me. I'm quite involved in that process, and we can see what happens. Because if we could even do that if there's a collective interest from the Arctic data community to plug into the decade. We can do that more formally to have a kind of formal relationship between the two, and I can help liaise that with IOC UNESCO if that's interesting.
Great. So I can say that I'm interested, but this comes back to the idea of us doing this all around the same table. Is I know that Sandy has voiced interest as well. That's come up actually months ago or weeks ago at least in SAON discussions.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'd like to do is with Arctic Data Committee and related being linked to the SAON and roads and IASC, maybe doing that as a broad engagement, because I think it goes well beyond just the data, as you well know. So,
no, absolutely. I think that's a really good idea. Yeah. And Taco, of course, is involved. Peter Persiersens from UNESCO and Linwood Pendleton. He's leading that on the executive planning group. So, I mean, I can liaise in there, but if it's a more formal thing, we can figure out how to make these things click together. It'd be really nice to see that.
Yeah, well, at minimum, even if it's not super formal, just a team of us, a group of us going rather than just the data folks, because I think, yeah, many of us would have interest. So.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you for that.
No problem. I will paste in the, if I figure out how to do this, figure out how to actually get this mailing list link distributed. There was a request in the chat. So
yeah, I see that.
Yeah, I'll try to figure it out. I don't know how I was added. Mysterious things happen. Apparently I was chairing a session at the global planning meeting. Nobody told me. So that was good. All right.
Excellent. Thank you. Any other thoughts, comments, topics that we want to bring up while we're here together? Okay, not hearing anything. I would like to bring the session to a close. The chats are saved, Michael, and the whole thing is saved, the chats, the video, audio, and so on. And you can save it yourself just to the right of your everyone in the chat if you hit the 3 dots. Yeah, so there we go. Alan's explaining there. I put in a message. I don't think I've heard back. I'll have to check my Slack channel, just asking the organizers to when the videos, et cetera, will be posted, but they will be posted at some point. And I'll see if there's anything. Okay, so Alan had reported saying they'll then, at some point, they'll be posted to the YouTube linked to the AOS agenda. So for anybody who'd like to, reference these sessions, they can do so. Okay, well, with that, I'll bring this session to a close. Our next session is at 2:30 Greenwich Mean Time, or UTC, and that'll be just an hour and a half is scheduled for that. I don't know, I'm going out to a couple of community members and asking for input on some of these topics. We had a white paper that I'll just go over very briefly. Unfortunately, the author to the white paper had to withdraw. And that white paper is focused more on the AI machine learning aspects of new technologies and methods, but we're also hoping to have some discussion about the platforms, what are the opportunities, challenges, considerations, and so on. How do we situate those within our community? So thank you so much for all of your time and contributions. We really appreciate you engaging in the AOS process, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you again.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for organizing.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Shannon, are you still there?
Yes.
So just quickly, I may not quite make the start of this evening's session. Are you okay, do you think, to get there on time to the first writing session?
Yes.
Okay, because I just don't know exactly how long the defense will go. I think they cap it at 3 hours, which would make me half hour late for the writing session, but I don't know that it will take 3 hours. So.
Well, you never know with those things.
Exactly. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward, excellent candidate and so on. So I don't expect any problems, but it also might turn into a lot of discussion because it's a really interesting dissertation. So.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, and we'll see you later in the day.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Peter. Okay.